So as I was developing the look of the gun, I was definitely looking at some references, but overall, I was mostly going with the feel and you know, what was the deciding factor is whether or not this material looks realistic to me, not necessarily copying the material from the image. So that's why sometimes you end up with plastic that it's good enough to sell the idea of the plastic, but if you start comparing, in real world the bump would be a lot less, the color would be different. Again, depends on the lighting conditions. So I would say just go by how it feels, and the same goes for this metal. This metal right here, this shader, doesn't exist in KeyShot by default, and it's actually only achievable through the graph editor, which I'm gonna explain right now. So it's actually a lot less scarier than it looks. A normal, let's take a look at something more or less simple. Let's take a look at this glass. Normally, you're only looking at these options right here. The glass has a refraction index, the textures. In this case, it has a bump that creates these horizontal lines. It has the color, and it has a label, which is a small arrow right here. And that's pretty much it. You can choose it to be two-sided or one-sided, and then you can adjust the refraction, so basically how much light it gives back when the light hits it. In this case, it goes right through. The higher it goes, the more it refracts. But usually you are fine with playing just with these settings, and even if it's a plastic, you just set up the diffuse, the specular, the diffuse transmission, and then plug in the textures for the bump, which will be this one right here. But then sometimes you have to go a little further, and even with simple, even the simple shaders have this material graph editor tab. So this is the final outcome. This is the texture plugged in into color, and here it's a lot more straightforward to understand. But then for people coming from different rendering softwares, maybe the graph editor is a simpler concept to grasp. So we have textured map literally plugged in into bump, and we have plastic, which is plugged in into the label. It's this piece right here. It's the arrow texture. You can see the preview right here, plugged in into the label. In the regular way you're used to looking at it, it's right here. You just add the label and then select the label type as plastic. If we switch the label type from plastic to metal, you notice that it changes in the metal, into the metal here. Again, if we turn off the textures like bump, turned off, color, turned off, still linked but turned off. If we delete it, it just disappears. So a lot of times it makes sense to start with a simple view and then switch to the graph editor. And then once you develop the understanding of how things plug in into each other, and you know, what are the limitations, you can start creating some things that are a little more complex. What's happening here with the metal shader is you can see that the occluded areas of this mesh are lighter, and that's happening because we have this outcome. We achieved the look of this metal using, instead of using the color and bump, which you can see is not being used here, it's achieved through opacity and labels. So there's a bunch of labels plugged in with a bunch of textures, like one texture map, that's 1, 2, 3, and some of the texture maps are plugged in through occlusion. If it's easier to understand here, you can see that there's not much, not many settings here, even in the textures, because this shader just becomes a monstrosity here, and it's going to be impossible to control. And that's why once you create something complex that really works for you, a great tip is saving it into the library, and it's always going to be accessible right here. So I have this shader. Once you develop it and play around with the look and you like it, I used the same setup to get this plastic look. Let's take a look at this plastic. I still have the outcome, and all of the intricacies of the surface are achieved through labels. Especially, you can see that these scratches, they have bump, they have their own reflectivity, and it looks like layered materials, like layered shaders, but in reality they're not, because you cannot combine shaders as far as I know in current version of Keyshot. But by plugging in the same map into specular bump and opacity, you can get some interesting scratches. You can go about layering and like multiple like kind of like a more complex look through the labels. And you can see that if I go to labels, it's not exactly clear. Like, I already started creating this in the graph editor, just bringing in a lot of tools. As an example, the nodes, besides advanced and besides the occlusion, they have some interesting utilities. So you can adjust color on individual nodes, add bump, color key mask. Not all of them are like extremely useful, in my opinion, like cellular and like these texture generating plugins, texture generating nodes that imitate procedural marble, procedural scratches. They are not necessarily useful, but to me the most useful ones are color gradient, curvature, and occlusion, because that literally means that even with the example of the metal, if I unplug occlusion, everything is going to be just one plain color. And let's actually take a look and try and build a very simple system for an occluded shader. I'm gonna pause right here, and I'm gonna bring some simple like cube geometry and or something, and we're gonna take a look.